Hello and welcome back. So it finally happened, like many of you already have been. I also have been playing Old School RS Trailblazer during the past week or so. I put it off for a couple of weeks. I said I don't really want to do this, I don't really want to commit to this, but at the same time it's a limited mode. We're only going to be able to play it in its current iteration at least for a very short amount of time, and it's going away in January and never coming back, at least probably not in the exact same format. So I have been playing for about a week or so. Many of you have been confused about not seeing me in the friends chat. I am in there. I'm just on my old school account and not on my main. So I struggled with thinking of a way to make content by playing Trailblazer, and initially I thought of doing a progress series. A lot of people are doing progress series right now. A lot of them are really great and are probably going to include a lot more progression and just much more exciting content than I could. So I think what I'm going to do instead is, first I'm going to briefly talk about things that I think work really well in the Trailblazer mode and that should be brought back, and then some things that, at least in my opinion, I'm not as big of a fan of, but I know that opinions on that are going to vary. And then after that, I'd also like to talk about, would this kind of mode work in Runescape 3? Because ultimately that would be my goal, is to see some sort of limited mode, seasonal mode come to RS3 as well as Old School RS. And that doesn't mean that people necessarily have to choose between them. It would probably be better if you had them at different times of the year so people don't have to pick and choose. But I think this is such a great game mode, and it works really well in RuneScape. Seasonal modes have worked really well in other games. I think that RS3 is kind of the next frontier to possibly think about expanding into. So first of all, for the pros for Trailblazer, and honestly there are a lot of them. I'm just going to mention a few of the very best ones. First of all, it's always fun to start a new account, but it can be really grindy to do the same stuff that you've done, especially if you've started an Iron Man. If you're someone like me who's had a main in RS3, who's had an alt in RS3, who's had an Iron Man in RS3, and who has done the same thing in Old School in the past, you've done all these starter quests and the starter content many times over. The faster XP rate that you get in Trailblazer and the quicker progression honestly gives everything a fresh new coat of paint and a fresh feel, and it doesn't feel like you're playing the exact same game that you've started so many accounts on before in the past. In the leagues too, they did change up the relic system, so now everyone gets XP rates, everyone gets skilling relics, and everyone gets combat relics. There's no longer a choice that has to be made between the two, which I think is in a lot of ways a very good choice, because it means that everyone has access to a way to increase their skilling and make it faster, because there's a lot of tasks related to that. Everyone also gets much faster and easier Slayer and combat training, and killing bosses is easier and less grindy, and your drop rate is increased, so getting the item that you're searching for isn't going to take quite as long. And I think it's good that everyone has access to that, and that's because the way that the task system is set up is every different part of content in the game has tasks related to it. So it's really not a good idea to pick and choose between your playstyles if you're going for getting as many league points as possible, because you're going to have to skill, you're going to have to train combat, and you're going to have to grind some bosses. So giving everyone the access to powerful abilities in all three I think was a nice touch. One of my very favorite aspects about Trailblazer, and to be honest this may have been a change that was made out of necessity because of the fact that you're limited to certain areas and you can't just go anywhere in the game that you want, but many quests in the game and many tasks and unlocks complete automatically when you unlock a new region, which I'm a huge fan of. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I mentioned having to do the same content all over again every single time you start a new account. Well, in Trailblazer you get to skip, not all of that, but you get to skip a decent amount of that. Some areas, I think Fremennik is one of the main ones, but that auto-completes a lot of quests when you unlock the area for the first time. If you unlock the Fremennik region, you get Dragon Slayer 2 done. You don't have to go through that quest. You wouldn't be able to, depending on the areas that you unlocked, of course. But this means that you have access to a lot of the end game content in the region without having to go through a several hour-long quest grind in order to unlock everything. Personally, that's something I'd like to see expanded upon even further, but I know that a lot of people haven't created a million new accounts before in the past, and to them, doing the quests all over again might make for a nice change of pace. So that one's definitely debatable. Another thing that I really like about Trailblazer is the community aspect. I've been playing Old School RuneScape for the past few years, off and on, and honestly, the community is the most vibrant in Trailblazer that I've seen in a long time. A lot of people are talking and sharing strategies, and I've just been doing Slayer tasks or agility, and I just see people talking about the drops they got or what they're planning on doing next. And I think having the different areas to unlock and the fact that you have to plan, oh, I want to do this, but this means I have to give up this piece of content. That makes for a lot of things to share with your friends or even just strangers that are standing around. Because of course when you have a mode that has so many different options and so many different routes to take, people are going to be very opinionated on what they think the best is or what they think the best area to unlock is, and that in my experience has led to a lot of very open and free discussion. And now I just wanted to briefly mention a couple of things that I personally consider cons with the mode, and these are up for debate, and some people are definitely going to disagree and think that these are actually pros. But I'll mention them really briefly. The first of all is having to complete quests. I don't really enjoy having to do that all over again, especially because this is a mode where almost every single task is focused on skilling in combat. There are a couple tasks that are quest related, but there are very, very few. So your actual league progression feels like it's not really happening when you're doing quests. You're pretty much only doing quests because you want to unlock a new area or piece of content. I did a couple quests to unlock the initiate armor, for example, which it's nice to have initiate armor, but it doesn't really feel like I'm making league progression, and it doesn't really feel like I'm doing league stuff when I'm just doing a starter early game quest. So the next thing is clues. So I ended up having a lot of uncompletable clues that I had to just end up dropping, whether it was because of an item that was unobtainable because it required an area or a piece of content that I hadn't unlocked, but I also got a lot of clues that required me to go to Al-Kharid, and I didn't have the desert region unlocked. So I'm not really sure what was up with that or if that was intended, but I was not able to complete very many of my early game clues, and I ended up just eventually giving up on them when I was really excited to do clues and start unlocking some of those unique items, especially because there are so many league tasks related to your clue collection. And the last thing, and this really isn't that big of a gripe at all, but there are a few minor quality of life items that are gated behind areas that you normally would not want to unlock at all. So one example that I have of this is the goldsmithing gauntlets. So the desert in Trailblazer is considered by most to be a pretty useless area. There's not really a whole ton of exciting endgame content or unlocks from the desert. But one thing that you can't do is you can't get goldsmithing gauntlets because the guy who changes your gauntlets for you is in the Al-Kharid mine. And I understand that the goldsmithing gauntlets and unlocking them is part of the reward from unlocking the desert, but at the same time, there are quite a few items like that in Trailblazer where the item itself is not necessarily related to any content in that area. There just might be an NPC that happens to be standing in the desert or standing in Mauritania, so you can't receive the item, even though it's not necessarily desert or Mauritania related, without unlocking that area. It would be nice to have an alternative, maybe like a difficult task to unlock, to get a few quality of life items, especially for things that just help out with skilling. So that was my list of pros and cons, and there are more. Honestly, there are a lot more pros than there are cons. I think the good outweighs the bad, but at the same time, I think that it's important with no matter how fun and how good a mode is to still be looking for ways to potentially improve, because that's where innovation comes from. Okay, now we're finally to the part of the video where I want to talk about RuneScape 3. Currently, RS3 does not have a seasonal format. It does of course have access to Iron Man, so we have a glimpse of what this would look like, because Iron Man has been out for a long time, and I'm sure many of you have Iron Man accounts and have experienced that mode. But what would Iron Man look like if A, everything was much faster to train, some quests were already unlocked, and boss drops were much easier to obtain because the drop rate was increased? I think it's important to point out that a lot of games have done seasonal modes before. And so if RS3 was to introduce one at some point, we would have a lot of other games in the past to look back at and see what works well and what doesn't. It doesn't just have to be old school. One example I have of this is Diablo 3, which has had a seasonal mode for a long time. I personally have played a lot of it, and I really like the Diablo 3 progression system a lot and how the seasonal achievements work. In some ways, I think that some aspects of Diablo 3 would be better served for a RuneScape 3 seasonal system than the way that old school has chosen to do it. So the first thing to consider is, if a limited format seasonal mode was to come to RS3, what would it look like? So far we have two examples of seasonal modes in old school. So the first one, they decided to limit everyone to one area, and that was the continent of Zeah. So you could go and do everything on Zeah. I believe you actually had to unlock the different regions of Zeah by completing tasks, but eventually the whole continent of Zeah and everything on there you had access to. I think in some ways this was really cool because it forced people into doing things that they normally would not do for training skilling and training combat and doing Slayer assignments that maybe they would not normally choose. But the downside is this wouldn't really work in RS3 because I don't think there's one sealed in area that would work well, that would have content that would work for every single skill, especially with the newer skills where they are very area dependent in terms of how you can train them. So Leagues 1 was really fun, but I think at least until RS3 comes out with a continent that has access to every skill, a bunch of Slayer monsters, a bunch of bosses, a lot of different ways to train, until that happens, Leagues 1 is probably off the table, at least in terms of the way that format was built for RS3. So that brings us to the idea of Leagues 2. So I think Leagues 2 is a lot closer in terms of how it would work in RS3, and that has the limited area. So you start with just one area, everyone's contained within Misthallen, and then you get to unlock more areas by doing tasks, which you start off with a limited amount of tasks that you can do in Misthallen, but then as you unlock more areas, you have more options and you have access to more tasks. So this format works very well for Old School, and I think the reason why is because the areas are fairly well balanced in Old School. There's access to end game stuff in pretty much every single area. Even the areas that don't have bosses at least have a lot of end game skills and quests and things that are worth a lot of league points that you can do. So I worry with RS3 that even though this would be a really fun mode, it probably would not be nearly as well balanced as it is in Old School. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, the new skills are very much area gated in terms of how you can train them. Archaeology, there's only a certain few spots that you can train. So if we wanted to area gate RS3, one of a couple things is going to happen. Either there's these default areas that everyone has to unlock because that's where the best archaeology and divination spots are, and how else are you supposed to train them? Or a lot of exceptions have to be made in order to grant people access to dig sites without having to unlock that specific area. Also, there's the question of weapons and gear unlocks, which are also in RuneScape 3 very much gated to particular areas. For example, if we were to area gate different areas of the RS world in RS3, Araxi would be a massive advantage for anyone who had access to it. So I would worry that unlocking Mauritania would kind of almost become a default for anyone who wanted to do any late game PVM. And maybe that's not a big problem. We saw that to some extent in Old School with how good Kondarin is for mid-game content. A lot of people unlocked Kondarin, but I think that Araxi would be an even greater extent of you just have to get this area and you really don't have a choice. And the alternative is you make an exception and grant everyone access to Araxi, but then it kind of takes away some from the area gating. And I think one decent way to get around this would be to give everyone access to Daemonheim, which you might have to anyway just because there's an entire skill that's concentrated there, but then at the very least everyone has access to tier 80 weapons, and that's enough to do many of the bosses in the game, and probably every single boss for people who are really comfortable and skilled PVMers. But I think there are other ways to make it a limited mode without necessarily having to use the same area gating system where you get one area or two areas, in the case of Old School, unlocked by default to start with, and then you get your choice of 3 more, and that means you have to leave out a few areas. The first idea that I had is possibly introducing a factor where you're much more limited in terms of your relics, in terms of the path that you choose to go down, whether you want faster XP rates and access to the elite tasks that require getting a lot of XP or getting a bunch of 99s, and it would still be possible if you chose other routes, but much more difficult. Or then you could possibly choose like a drop rate enhanced, which would make it much easier for you to get all of your items from bosses. It would be way quicker than for anyone else. Or maybe combat bonuses that make it easier to kill bosses, and then the people that chose the skilling route don't get to do that as easily. They can still kill bosses, it's just harder for them. Another method of gating that has worked in other games, Diablo 3 is one example, is giving you access to certain items or abilities or skills or things that you can do at high levels that are gated and that you have to choose between. So whether that's like you get your tier 90 weapon, but you have to make a choice between which one you want it to be, and that might cause certain bosses to be available to you, but other bosses aren't, or at least are going to be much more difficult because you're going to have to do it with lower tier gear that maybe is not available to you. The bosses themselves could be gated, and maybe you could unlock more and more of them by progressing and doing more Leagues tasks. And that means everyone has access to War's Retreat, but you can only use it to teleport to 1 or 2 bosses, and then you have to do more tasks to unlock more, and in the end, no one has access to all of them, so there's still a choice. Those are just a few suggestions that I have and ideas that I have for how to limit things in RS3 that might be a little smoother and might work a little bit better than just gating things off by area. But I wanted to save one of my favorite ideas for last. And this one, of course, comes from Diablo 3. So Diablo 3 has an achievement system based on the season, and everyone can do all of the achievements if you grind hard enough. However, the really late game ones, the very last tiers of the achievement system, have some of the best rewards and some of the highest achievement value bonuses. However, they are really, really difficult to do and take a really long time. And I think this might be the best way. So everyone could have access to every area, every boss, every item, every skill. However, it would just take probably the entire 2 to 3 months or however long the season would go to get there. And yes, this would mean that probably the vast majority of the player base would not unlock everything, and maybe only a small handful of people would play enough or be able to complete all of the tasks well enough to unlock every single area, every single boss. So with this sort of a system, you still have the choice, because for the vast majority of your time playing the mode, you're not going to have access to everything. You're going to be very, very limited. But then as time goes on, things get progressively less and less limited. This is still the case in Old School. However, I think the biggest issue with Old School is that for people who really, really grind that first week, they can get all their areas unlocked pretty quickly. So within your first 6-7 days of playing, the mode is already as open as it's ever going to be. You can still work on things for league points, but unfortunately you're not going to be unlocking any new areas or any new bosses or anything like that. It's all unlocked. I just know in other seasonal games where I've played, having an achievement system that isn't just points, but actually leads to real tangible rewards that you're working on for either the entire season or at least the vast majority of it, really adds another layer of motivation. Because it's still fun to play Trailblazer when you have all your modes unlocked. You still have a lot of things to go for. You still have, your Bandos armor to grind for. You still have all the 99s you want to get to grind for. There's still plenty of stuff to do, don't get me wrong. But I think the idea of having that next area the entire time and the excitement of the new fun things that you could do in that area available for the entire season would add another layer of motivation, another layer of achievement, and also not result in people not being able to access certain kinds of content that they still want to do, but they still have to prioritize their content and decide what is most important to do first. So I do want to say there is going to be a podcast that I'm going to do with Protoxx and Maikeru where we're going to talk about this topic more in depth, and you're going to get 3 different perspectives instead of just one man rambling to himself. And so if you're into that, there's going to be a link in the description and probably a card on the video whenever that podcast is uploaded, which will be sometime in the next coming week. But with that being said, if you can't tell, obviously I would love to see the same kind of seasonal limited mode come into RS3. I think that Old School and RS have bounced ideas off of each other and incorporated, not a lot, but a few of the content ideas that the other game mode has had before in the past, so I could totally see this happening. I would love it if it does, and I also hope that the 2 modes wouldn't happen at the same time, so people would have a chance to try out both. And if you're still watching, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think this would be a great idea for RS3? Do you think that seasonal modes, limited modes, just work better in Old School for some reason, just because of the way it is, and that's perfectly fine? Feel free to join the friends chat and we can talk about it. I also have a link to my brand new Discord server down in the description, which you are all invited to as well, of course. And I'll see you guys next time, where I attempt to come up with a different video idea that I could do on Trailblazer that isn't just a progression series, because I'm planning on playing this game mode for maybe the rest of the duration that it's up, at least another couple of weeks or so. We'll figure something out. Alright, I'll see you guys next time, and bye.